Hello, and welcome to the GAI online lecture series. I'm John Yoon, and today we are covering network effects and platforms. So let's start with a conventional product, something such as breakfast cereal. And how we assess this type of market, at least on a foundational and fundamental level, is supply and demand, right? There's a certain demand for breakfast cereal and a certain supply, and their interaction determines the price and quantity. So it's relatively straightforward. However, that might not necessarily be the case for every good that we have in our modern economy. For example, something such as ride-sharing apps, Uber, Lyft, Juno, social media, as well as credit cards and email and fax machines. These types of products require a different set of analyses and tools. So in order to really get an understanding of these markets, we have to develop a number of concepts. Let's start with network effects. What are network effects? Here's a seminal definition from Michael Katz and Carl Shapiro. There are many products for which the utility or the benefits that a user derives from the consumption of the good increases with the number of other agents consuming the good. Interesting. And therefore depends upon the number of other users who are in the same network. Let's go back to breakfast cereals. You probably have your favorite breakfast cereals, assuming you're having breakfast cereals. Maybe you're on the keto diet and that's not a thing for you. You probably don't care if there's a million other people who like that brand, or there's 1.2 million, or even if there's a billion people who love that brand. You know, maybe you care on some level, like, oh, I'm with the hot trend on the cereals here. Or maybe it's a disutility, like, wow, everyone's having the same cereal. I don't like that. But generally speaking, it's not going to really affect your consumption value. But that's not going to be true for other types of goods where you care about the number of people on the network, if you will. So what are examples of this? Well, we hinted at this in the prior slide. Email is a classic example where you have a benefit from others being on the same network, right? If email was just yourself, it's not that valuable. It's more of a database, a storage for your notes. Social media has clear benefits where as other people are joining, your utility from joining increases, or if you're already on the network, as more people join, family members or friends, now you can communicate with more people. Fax machines, telephones, these are all classic examples that exhibit network effects. And so really network effects are very strong in areas of communication, where people want to communicate with other people. And as more people are on that same network, so they share the same method of communication, whether it's through messaging, it's through a certain type of posting. It just depends on the mechanism, but you want people to communicate in the same way, the same standard. And as more people join, that benefit to you increases. So let's do a formal definition of not just network effect, we just defined that, but more in terms of the economics of it, and break this down a little bit and unpack the network effect. So to summarize Katz and Shapiro's definition very quickly, a product is more valuable the more people use it. So we can break down the effect of joining a network into two effects. The first is a private gain to the individual, and the second is a social benefit to others on the network. So I think that's a nice paradigm. You have a personal benefit from joining a social network, let's say, in that it unlocks some features that you want. Maybe there's a news feed that you particularly like how that social network does it. You might like that other people are on it. And then there's a social benefit, which we just mentioned, in that you joining can create a spillover, a positive spillover effect to others who are already on the network or are contemplating joining the network that you might not internalize. So what is an externality? So another way of saying this is there's an adoption externality. And an externality is a benefit or cost that's imposed on a third party that that the person making the decision doesn't necessarily get, right? So it really comes to the size and significance of this external effect. So Leibowitz and Margolis, they have a series of papers largely written in the 1990s that make a distinction between network effects, which we just defined, and network externalities. These terms are often used interchangeably, but I like how they make this distinction between an externality is really reserved for situations where this adoption effect is so strong that it creates some inefficiency, whether in terms of the size of the network or whether the network exists at all. So in terms of this externality idea, the way we can think of it is if we consider the amount of activity on the x-axis here, and the value on the y-axis, let's just say some activity joining a network or how much you participate on a social network. There's some marginal benefit and marginal cost, and let's say that the benefit is really high when you first, for the first, 30 minutes on a network. But once you hit hour 5, the returns hopefully are diminishing. And there's a certain marginal cost of your time. And so there's some optimal level that you participate in terms of the activity Q prime. But if we incorporate the social benefit, meaning your participation on the network, your availability, that really increases the benefits to others, the true benefit is really something larger than your private benefit. That's the basic idea. And so economic theory would predict that you should be participating more, Q star. So this raises a question: are networks inefficiently small or inefficiently used? And this goes back to that positive spillover effect that we mentioned earlier. And again, it comes down to the size of the private and social benefits. Although it is true, it can be true that the private gains, let me restate that. It can be true that the private gains are sufficient to expand a network and the social benefits are marginal, especially after a certain network size, right? So we don't want to overstate the adoption externality nor understate it. It will just depend on the particular circumstance, and as mentioned here, is on the size of the network. Take something such as education, which is often touted as a positive externality. As the education level of the population increases, there's virtues to that. Perhaps less crime, better informed voters. There's a lot of good things that come out of that. So the question then is, are people fundamentally getting undereducated because they're not incorporating the full social benefit from getting educated? And this is something that the great economist Milton Friedman discussed, and he concluded that it's largely your private benefits from becoming educated is really, really high, and so you really have the proper incentives to get that education. Maybe on the margin, you would get educated more if you receive the full social benefits, but it's probably not a fundamental problem. And so the same goes true for a network. It might or might not be a fundamental problem. It's just we shouldn't assume it is. Now, on the other side of the coin, when we talk about network effects, sometimes we really discuss this feedback effect. And what do we mean by that? Network effects can lead to a situation where as more users join, this increases the attractiveness of the network. We just define that as the network effect. That's what we're talking about here. But as the attractiveness of the network increases, then this can in turn lead to more users. And this goes into a cycle. With more users, this further increases the attractiveness of the network, and this process continues. So this has led some to raise a number of questions. Do network effects and first mover advantages create insurmountable lock-in after markets tip to a winner-take-all outcome and potential adoption of inferior products or standards? Do these network effects create unassailable barriers to entry and durable antitrust market power? There's a lot here to unpack, and this video isn't intended to fully address these questions, but I do want to comment on these to some degree. Just to give a little background, the economic literature on network effects really started in the 1970s, fully blossomed in the 1980s, and continued and matured into the 1990s. And it really laid the foundation for the literature on multi-sided platforms, which will be the subject of the second half of our talk. One of the central themes of the literature, among many on network effects, uh, are the questions that I raised in the prior slide. Are there systematic and significant potential market failures where we're stuck on an inferior network, we're locked in, it tips towards winner take all, and so we end up with monopolistic type of outcomes? And Leibowitz and Margolis, who I mentioned earlier, really challenged this view on a number of dimensions. Let's take VHS versus beta, and just a little bit of history here. For some of you, this is standard, right? You probably grew up with going to Blockbuster and renting videotapes. And for others, you're probably saying, what are you talking about? So for VHS, this was a standard set by a consortium led by Matsushita. And what it did is it recorded and played videos. And it was first introduced in the late 70s, August 1977, in the United States. And the initial recording length was 120 minutes. And the idea was to capture a full sporting event, or at least close to a full sporting event, as well as a full movie. But this ended up making the tape bigger. Betamax was a standard set by Sony. It did the same thing, record and played pre-recorded video. This was first introduced in the United States 2 years earlier, in November 1975. And the initial recording length at the time was 60 minutes. Now, Sony subsequently changed that, but that was a critical decision in that Sony felt like consumers valued portability over length. Now, they value both, right? You want both length and portability. But there was a trade-off at the time because this was a physical tape that you had to insert. And this was really the defining moment in the market, in that this design decision arguably largely led to the success of VHS over Betamax. So this has led some to use this as an example of networks tipping towards one, which is VHS, over another, which was Beta, even though the claim is that VHS had poor quality, both in video and sound, and it somehow won simply because it got the ball rolling, and then it got that network effect. So one thing to note is, recall that VHS came in after Betamax, so it actually did not have first mover advantage. So it overcame Sony's first mover advantage. But the convention is that Beta is better. The tech that should have won, you can still find articles that tout the benefits of Beta over VHS. But the reality is that the evidence, if you go back to the time in which they were competing, is that these were comparable products, and it wasn't absolutely clear that VHS was inferior to Beta. So here's a quote: "Although many held the perception that Beta produced a better picture than VHS, technical experts have concluded that this was in fact not the case, and Beta had no advantages over VHS other than being first on the market." Others, Lardner's History of the Video Cassette Market finds there were no real technical differences. So this gets to the question: are we stuck with an inferior network? And the representative argument here is that we cannot move from one technology to a superior one, from one standard to a better one, from one kind of network to a better one, right? A little redundant there, but that's the basic idea. Now, one observation is there are potential transition issues from one product to another for a lot of industries in a free market economy, right? A low-cost entrant, let's say someone who has a better production process, comes in. Do they immediately gain all the shares? Unlikely, right? Consumers have brand loyalty, there's distribution, there's branding, there's marketing that has to be overcome. And so just because there's network effects and there's transitional issues doesn't mean that this is somehow unique to markets that have network effects. This is again from Leibowitz and Margolis. We have overwhelming evidence that markets do make transitions to superior products and standards. Another observation is we can have multiple networks or platforms in a given market. Now, I know we haven't formally discussed platforms, and we will shortly, but it's the basic idea that just because there's these strong effects that sort of bind these various groups together, or a given group, doesn't mean it's the only winner-all type of market. And that's true in video consoles for Apple and Android. for credit cards as well as social media. Now, why do multiple networks coexist? I think a very important point is consumers have heterogeneous tastes, and this leads to product differentiation. This is very critical in that a lot of presumptions that we make about networks tipping, not completely, but somewhat, is based on some degree of homogeneity in products. And if products are largely homogeneous and you have a certain cost structure, then you can actually end up with a result of a winner take all and tipping towards a certain market. But heterogeneous tastes mean that you can differentiate and cater to different consumers. And so if consumers, especially if consumers can multi-home, and multi-homing means that you're on different networks and you switch between them, especially if these costs to switch are not particularly high, then this can really create a degree of competition in networks, even if one network gets started first and gets the ball rolling. And you can see this with social networks, in fact, where certain types of social networks cater to certain, let's say, demographics, younger group of consumers, as opposed to an older cohort. And this relates to a second point. Network effects can be very local, and this is research by Catherine Tucker at MIT. She's done a lot of great research in this area. So the idea here is that you don't need large networks per se to induce people to join, but rather the right network in terms of who joins. So the presence of certain groups, mentioned this just a second ago, kids and parents, for example, could result in a negative spillover effect from certain networks, right? So we think of this as this positive effect as more people join. It could be, especially if we recognize network effects are local, that this creates a negative effect or a repulsion effect, if you will. If you know that your parents are on a social network, this can create, at least for certain types of activities, a movement to a different type of social network. So the bottom line, and I mentioned this already, is that issues of market failure regarding tipping and lock-in are more severe and likely problematic with greater homogeneity and the presence of certain cost structures. And to make the final point on this, let's take a look at the fax machine and the arc of its commercial success. In 1966, Xerox introduced the MagnaFax telecopier, and this was a major leap in fax technology. From 1973 to 1983, the number of fax machines in the US went from 30,000 to 300,000. And the early adopters were newsrooms and corporations. And so something as classic as a fax machine in terms of illustrating network effects, notice that to be valuable, it really only takes two people. If you're a corporation and you have two offices, well, you just need one in each office. Maybe you want more, but the idea there is that that's all you really need to unlock its value. Now, in 1989, its popularity really jumped. And in 1997, the fax machine really hit its peak. Now, since then, as we all probably know, fax machines have declined, but they're still commercially viable. It's widely used in the medical field, law enforcement, legal services, and I read Japan and Germany. I don't know why, but the Japanese and Germans really like the fax machine. From 1970 to today, it has been over 50 years. And at various network sizes, the fax machine has still been commercially successful. And so again, it doesn't mean that you have to take over the world in terms of how you communicate. It just needs a certain, often local network effect to still remain quite valuable. So let's transition to platforms, because network effects and platforms are intimately related, but they're slightly different. When we're talking about platforms, it's really about balancing. And so, here's a guy with socks balancing on something. And while this is a perhaps uncomfortable image, I don't know, a guy on some socks, it'll stick in your mind, hopefully. And that's the basic idea. And what are sort of examples of multi-sided platforms, at least in the context that we're discussing here today? We've mentioned ride sharing, something such as Uber. Uber is a platform that is really facilitating the exchange or transaction between drivers and passengers. Take credit cards, American Express. It's facilitating the exchange between merchants and cardholders. Take a search engine such as Google. It's facilitating the exchange between those who are looking for content, which Google provides, and really particularly for advertisers who are looking for the attention of users who are online searching for something. So it's really bringing those two groups together. Take radio, right? So platforms is not a new thing. We associate it, tend to, with the digital economy, but take radio. Similar to a search engine today, it's taking users, or in this case, listeners, and matching them with advertisers. So let's move to a definition of a platform, and this is from Evans and Schmalensee. A platform has two or more groups of customers who need each other in some way, but who cannot capture the value from their mutual attraction on their own, and rely on the catalyst, the platform, to facilitate value-creating interactions between them. There's a lot there, so I broke it up in different parts, but this is a fairly comprehensive definition, and so I like it to start with. Hadju and Wright have slightly different approach. They say a platform is two or more groups that directly interact, or direct is not necessarily there's a transaction per se. Each group is affiliated with the platform in some manner, typically through platform-specific investments. So in a nutshell, and this is a term that Evans uses often, is that a platform is a matchmaker who facilitates exchanges between multiple interdependent groups, right? So it's not just random groups on the street that, hey, why don't you guys exchange? There has to be a common interest, a desire to exchange. But there's some frictions, as the first definition stated, that can hinder them just getting together on their own, or at least on the scale that sort of can unlock a lot of value. So this matchmaker brings these two groups together on the platform, at least the virtual platform. It doesn't physically have to be a platform, although it can be. So platforms are also called multi-sided markets or two-sided markets. And in a casual sense, that's perfectly fine. In antitrust, when we talk markets, generally it's a term of art. We're talking about relevant product or geographic markets, and so that can introduce a number of issues. So I generally like to just use the term multi-sided platforms or platforms. And to break this idea down a little bit further, let me map how they interact. Let's take a search engine. There are two groups of consumers. Those are users and advertisers. And they each have different values for access to the platform. For users, we know that there's a search bar, and we type in our query, and that gives us a certain content. That's why we're attracted to a platform. Now, advertising can be part of that, or it can be a repulsion. It will depend on the consumer and maybe the type of query. But for advertisers, it's pretty clear. What they're attracted to is not the ability to search, maybe as when they have their user hat on, but when they have their advertiser hat on, what they're seeking is user attention. And so how the platform obtains revenue from each group is quite different. So from users, they don't obtain direct revenue. It's free, or it's a zero price. For advertisers, there's a cost per click, meaning they have to pay in order to participate on the platform. And the way that they pay is that when a consumer clicks on an ad, and that price is set through an auction, that advertiser pays for that. And what is important is this interdependency, right? These aren't random groups. There's an attraction, and it really comes from the advertiser side. Users are looking for content, and that's what their platform provides, and advertisers are looking for those users. And so there's that interdependency, if you will. And notice that the zero price isn't because there's this benevolent philosophy in terms of the platform, in terms of giving users free stuff. Maybe there's a little of that, but the idea here is that you want to maximize the participation on the platform. And the way you do that, of course, you can maybe give people money, but holding aside a negative price, if you will, The way that you would do that is set it at the lowest possible price, which is 0. Let's look at the ride-sharing app platform, though, and it's going to be different. So the usefulness of this is that first it shows that platforms are not all the same. So here again, we have two groups, but in this case, passengers and drivers. So what's the value of a ride-sharing app to passengers? Well, it's access to drivers. And drivers, what's the value to them? Is the access to passengers. So how does this platform, such as Uber and Lyft or Juno, obtain revenue? It takes a slice of that transaction, right? There's a certain price that's set on the platform, and the passengers pay that price, and the drivers receive that revenue, and some of that is shipped off, if you will, to the platform. And so here, just like in a search engine, there's an interdependency, but here it goes both ways, in that the value of access for the drivers is the passengers, and vice versa. The value of access to the passengers are the drivers, and it creates this interdependency. And an important thing to note here is, unlike in the search engine where output, if you will, is measured differently, although highly correlated, here the both sides share a common output. So this gets us to two broad types of platforms. There's a transaction platform, which we just talked about, the ride sharing. Credit cards also have this feature. These are two more groups that directly interact, and this is a little bit different from the who and right definition I gave earlier, where this is an actual transaction, and they share a common output. A non-transaction platform, which we just described in terms of a search engine, and these are really a broad category in terms of advertising, newspapers, broadcast television, social media. These all fall under this umbrella. There's an absence of an actual transaction between the two groups. Rather, they indirectly interact, if you will. And they do not necessarily share a common output, but as I mentioned, they're highly correlated. So platforms are characterized by network effects. That's why we started this video with network effects. And just to remind ourselves, a direct network effect is a product is more valuable the more people use it. Now, not all platforms have direct network effects. Take ride sharing. The fact that other people are on Uber doesn't really directly affect your utility like social network, like joining a social network would. It's a little bit different. In fact, the relevant network effect in this case is something we call a cross-group effect or an indirect network effect. And here, the value of a product increases for one group the more that another group participates. So the real value that you as an Uber rider have joining the network is when you see other drivers joining. Did I get that right? Let me say it again. If you as an Uber passenger join, what you're interested in is how many Uber drivers there are. So a smartphone operating system, for example, is more valuable the more apps there are. A credit card is more valuable the more merchants accept it. And this goes back to that brief table that I showed you with ride sharing, and that there's that crossing of those cross group effects, if you will, where you care about the other side and their participation level. Now, for social media with advertising, while there's direct network effects, that doesn't translate necessarily into a cross group effect going both ways. In that, while you care about more users joining on the user side, you might not care that there's more advertisers trying to get your attention. But the advertisers clearly care about the users on that side. So these effects are not going to be the same depending on the platform. What are not platforms? Restaurants, retailers such as mass merchants as Walmart and Target, intermediate products, crop protection for food, utilities for factories, services such as banking, personal finance, life insurance, auto repair, plumbers, electricians, taxis, and airport shuttles. So here we have an example of a business that has both elements of a platform as well as a single-sided market. Take Amazon. Amazon in of itself is like Walmart. It's just an online version of Walmart. And that's a single-sided market. I know Walmart's online too, but just thinking of it as a brick and mortar. In Amazon Marketplace, what this is that it allows third-party sellers to use the Amazon platform, the interface and the review system, and possibly even the warehouse, to then match with consumers who are obviously looking for products. So that's a little bit different, and that's more of a two-sided market. And so here it's largely the same Amazon, but depending on the part of the business, it has characteristics that are a little bit different. So the key idea here is there's an interrelationship. Prices and profits for the two sides are interlinked. Take a shopping mall, which is actually a platform. Fewer amenities for shoppers reduces the number of shoppers at a mall, right? If the parking is horrible, you're probably going to be less likely to go there, which lowers prices and profits of the retailers. That hurts those retailers. In a similar way, higher prices to retailers in terms of renting the space, it could reduce the variety and types of retailers that are there, or it could raise their own prices. And this reduces the benefits to consumers. So another example is the restrictions on the number of Uber drivers. This can reduce the value of the platform. So this is from the Supreme Court in Ohio versus American Express. Striking the optimal balance of the prices charged on each side of the platform is essential for two-sided platforms to maximize the value of their services and to compete with their rivals. So what makes this different from breakfast cereals? The point being is that we have to understand this interdependency, and where the pricing on one side will affect the pricing or participation on the other side. And in turn, that could affect the pricing on that first side we talked about. Unless we really understand that mechanism, or at least appreciate it, we're not going to tend to get the right answer. And that's the point of the court's quote here. So what are some key economic implications for this? And I've mentioned this throughout. Cross-group effects can be powerful. We're balancing the interest. Here's the SOX guy again coming back. So we can't look at just one side of the platform. And the welfare effects of a platform's activities must be assessed across all groups. Now, sort of the final thing I want to talk about is how is this different from complements? So the question is, are platforms any different from markets involving complements? So here's one potential line of argument or objection. There's no difference in that there are complementarities between various groups on a platform. Software is a complement to hardware on an operating system platform. Objection 2. There's an interrelationship between those that make printers and ink, which are terrific complements, as there is an interrelationship between passengers and drivers on a ride-sharing platform. Let's address each of these in turn. And I'm not going to do justice to this in the short time that we have, but let me at least get some ideas started. Response 1 to objection 1. It is correct that software and hardware are complements in consumption, in that there is an interrelationship in their demands. Yet this is an incomplete assessment for platforms. Platforms are concerned with matching and facilitating exchange, which involves both production and consumption, which creates incentives to develop software in the first place, for example. So complements is really about the demand side, and platforms is about both supply and demand and the level of output in a given market. Response 2. This is in response to objection 2. While there are interrelationships for both printers and ink and passengers and drivers, for a complementary system, the same consumer buys both products, printers and ink, or razors and blades, for example. Consequently, the buyer pays both prices and internalizes the full cost of participating in the complementary system. Within a platform, however, there are cross-group effects that are not fully internalized by the participants on each side of the platform. Recall that a platform has two different groups and two different welfares. Whereas in a quote complementary system, you as a consumer of razors and blades, for instance, are consuming both. So you fully internalize the benefits and costs of the price, if you will, and how much you buy by weighing those considerations of both markets. Whereas with cross-group effects, because we're talking about two different groups, you might not fully internalize them. So it's the platform that really tries to generate or internalize those effects to facilitate their exchange. So final points, network effects matter, but it's the type and strength of these effects, they're not just uniform. Platforms matter, and we have to understand the different groups and the incentives of the platform and their monetization. So these are the same tools, just a different focus. Thanks so much.